And thanks, Jason, for that introduction. So as Jason said, today I'm going to be talking about B2B participant recruitment. To start with, I'm going to cover what we mean by hard to find participants, of which B2B is a subset. And then for anyone who hasn't tried it, I'll go over why B2B is hard. Next, I'll talk about the different sources we use at UX 24/7 to find participants, as well as a framework we created to help plan B2B recruitment. And finally, I'm going to share a few techniques we use and things you can try and consider, which will hopefully help making recruiting for B2B a little easier. So first of all, let me explain what we mean by hard to find participants. So people can fall into hard to find participant category for any number of reasons. It could be they have specific disabilities. For example, people who use screen readers, a pretty small category. Geography may play a role, such as in Germany, where people have greater data privacy concerns than in some other markets. Some people may not wish to turn a camera on or attend a research lab. Then there are those who lack time or lack the motivation. Maybe they're well paid and the incentive isn't particularly attractive. And another subset of hard to find participants is B2B, and that's our focus for today. So B2B means business to business. I'm sure you're probably all aware. And from a research perspective, that means recruiting people who work for either specific companies or in specific roles or with specific interests. And in research for our clients, we've recruited participants that range from C-suite executives to van drivers and everything in between. So why is B2B hard? Well, if we think about B2C, business to consumer research, what we have when recruiting participants there is a very large pool of potential candidates. The accessible population is huge. And even if we're quite niche in the subset we're aiming for, we still have quite a lot of available candidates. So if we contrast that with B2B, to illustrate the size of the B2B pool, I've created this waffle chart. And this represents the adult population of the US represented in a 10 by 10 matrix. So there's 331 million people in the US in the adult population. If we look at the subset of that is the candidate pool, if you wanted to conduct research with people of a working age, that brings that down to 207 million people. And finally, if you wanted to conduct research with people who just work at Walmart, this is the candidate pool there. Walmart's the largest employer in the US, and so that gives you 2.3 million people. But of course, we rarely want to conduct research with people based on their employer, and really we're looking for a specific role. And this chart represents the number of people who work for Walmart and are in a procurement or a transport role. And as you can see, that's 23,000 people. And I combined both roles because actually it would have meant me sort of having half a person coloured in there. But it's a good illustration actually of what we're often faced with in B2B recruitment, which is looking for the proverbial needle in the haystack. So now I'd like to talk about the sources of participants and where we can go to find them. So there are multiple sources you can use, whether you're an agency like us or an M brand. Firstly, there are participant recruitment agencies. And these are businesses where all or part of their activity is recruiting participants for research. Next, there are freelance recruiters. And these are quite hard to find actually, and they're typically individuals that some of the larger recruiters send jobs out to. In some markets, there are specialist recruiters. We know of one, for example, who is exclusively B2B and works on his own and uses LinkedIn amongst other resources to recruit B2B participants. Then there are research platforms, platforms like usertesting.com, and these typically include a panel of users, although B2B is not always possible through those. For us as an agency, we often recruit our clients' customer list, if we're allowed to do that. And obviously, if you're working for a brand yourself, you can do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And that's the final sort of process, which is do it yourself, which is slightly different for us as an agency, but for an end brand, it's pretty similar. So we'll look at each of those in a bit more detail. So first up was participant recruitment agencies. So I've got a couple of examples here. They range for, in the UK, for example, Focus for People. Their recruitment, participant recruiter we use a lot for B2C, in fact. There's also organisations like Testing Time, which have a slightly different approach to recruitment, and they're more international. And then also another organisation we use, Sago, which are a multinational market research company, but they also do standalone participant recruitment. And there are plenty of participant recruiters out there. We have over 80 in our global database, and we use directories such as this one, Greenbook, to go and find them. And in fact, if I'm doing the searches myself, or our ResOps team are, we'll be in Greenbook and we'll be filtering down on focus group recruiting, because although that's not UX research, it's the same kind of process. And if you can find agencies that do that, they generally can help you in the UX space as well. So the pros and cons here. So some B2B profiles can be delivered by agencies. And obviously where those are the case, the simpler ones, makes life a lot easier because they provide a full service, and the experience is very similar to when recruiting B2C. However, in our experience, the more difficult B2B profiles are generally not feasible. Excuse me. Worse is often that the agency think they are feasible, particularly if they're not used to doing B2B, and that particularly happens in international with maybe agencies you're not used to working with if you're going into new markets. And in those situations, they'll often say they can do it, but once they start doing the recruitment and the project's in flight, they realise they can't deliver, which obviously causes many more problems. Next up was Freelance Recruiters, and I'll brush over these quickly. They're very similar to agencies. As I mentioned, they're the kind of thing, kind of individual participant recruitment agency will go out to. And in this example here, it's pretty typical actually. There'll be an individual maybe running a Facebook group. I'm not sure if you can see the size here, but this Facebook group has 1,100 members, and that's not uncommon for one of these type of recruiters. So the pros and cons, same as agencies, but they're working on a smaller scale, so slightly more challenging. Next up are the specialist recruitment recruiters I mentioned, and there really aren't many of these around at all, and even fewer who do B2B. And in fact, they themselves are very hard to find. If you can find one, they are very good, but they're so selective, they won't always take the project on. That they will decide themselves whether they believe it's feasible. And if they do take it on, they tend to be very expensive. But obviously, if they do take it on, there tends to be higher authenticity because they act almost like a headhunter, and they tend to find people that don't typically participate in research. Next, I'll talk about the research platforms. So these are platforms such as usertesting.com, Userlytics, all the other ones you can see up there. And they've really grown since the pandemic, and a lot of them will provide through the subscription access to their user panel. It's also true for niche providers. If you're a researcher, you might have used Optimal Sort. They have their own sort of integrated panel in there. So again, you get access to that through the use of the tool. So the they can be very easy if it works, but a lot of the panels don't often include either many B2B profiles, or they may not know how many are in there, or if they are in there, they may be more like professional participants. So there can be issues around screening. You have to really work hard to screen in these panels. And of course, the platform can be expensive in the first place, even on a project basis, or if they force you into a sort of an annual subscription. If we can, we like to recruit from our clients' customers, and I know many brands whose research teams recruit their own customers too. If you're an agency like us, it means a big investment in information security because you have to demonstrate that you're treating your clients' data with care, and particularly if the client is sharing their customer list with you. But it can work really well. However, sometimes we're not allowed to recruit our clients' customers, or the internal research team isn't allowed to do it either. And that can be because stakeholders, or a stakeholder somewhere in the organization, is worried about who is talking to their customers. If you experience those barriers, it's worth keeping in mind someone somewhere in the organization will own the customer, so don't be put off. It could be that there's an account manager or someone in the sales team. In financial services, they're often called the relationship manager, and they will own the customer, and they just might need convincing of the benefits to them of their customer being invited into the research. In our experience, if you can get a customer to participate, it actually can have the effect of making them more loyal. So it's worth making that point if you can get to the owner of the customer and try and convince them to let them in. It can be quite slow to make it happen. There can be a lot of hurdles to get over before we can actually schedule participants. And it's worth noting that sometimes if the client is leading the recruitment, they can recruit the wrong profiles. It's generally not malicious, obviously, because they're vested in the research, but they may not know their customers intimately. And it happens more than you would imagine. It also happens that the internal team will overestimate how many of their customers they can get into the research. So sometimes if they've handled the research on our behalf, we can arrive ready for the moderated sessions, and actually we don't have the full quota because they've been over ambitious. So keep that in mind if you're going through your client, or if you are a client and you're relying on, or if you're within the brand rather, relying on someone else to sort the recruitment out for you. So because this process is quite detailed, I thought it worth illustrating a couple of different ways we go about doing it, because also I thought this might have relevance to both agencies working with their clients, but also brands who are doing research internally or thinking about doing it. So the first we use is when we're recruiting our clients' customers. So the first step is typically that the client will introduce us and the research to their customer by email. Oops, the bill just went forward. We typically provide the email script that sets out what the research is about, when it will happen, and who we want to interview and who we are. And we'll give them that script so that they can put that in the email out. There will also be information about data privacy, a link to our screener, so the participant candidate can click straight through. We typically build a screener in our survey tool, which also provides information about the research and data privacy again. And we have a couple of different ways of scheduling. In an ideal world, we'll pass the participant from the screener straight into an automated scheduling tool like Calendly, where they can pick their own time slot, and they'll also share contact details with us then. Excuse me. Alternatively, if we think it's going to be a really tricky recruit, and or if we're worried about dropouts, we'll build the session schedule into the screener, and we'll ask the participant to select sessions that they think they can make, and then those will pass through to our ResOps team, who will then manually schedule them. And then finally, we'll serve them the informed consent, NDA, and anything else that's relevant. And we can do that using an online digital signature tool, or in other ways, even in the survey sometimes, or in the Calendly system, depending on the client and the way the process is going to work. So another version of that is when the client does the scheduling, and you can see here, this changes the order of the scheduling and screening. They just flipped around. And this really illustrates the point I made earlier, that even if the client is doing the scheduling, don't assume that the participants are going to be the right profile. If it's possible, we will post-screen them to make sure the profile is correct. So finally, the do-it-yourself one. So obviously that kind of refers to what we were just talking about if you're a brand doing it yourself. But if you're not recruiting from within the customer base and you actually have got to go and find the participants from somewhere else, there are a lot of pros and cons of doing this. Excuse me. So if you can do it yourself, you do get control of the profiles, higher authenticity and more visibility, but it's really time consuming. Excuse me. It can actually be even more expensive, and it might not actually work. And I thought the best way to illustrate this would be through a case study. So this case study is for a company we work with called Arrival. They are an electric vehicle manufacturer, and this project involved discovery research to establish unmet needs of transport depot managers. As you might imagine, these were really difficult to find. And of the recruiters we went to, only one of them said they could do it. And they only actually found one participant. And when we did secondary screening, it turned out they were what we call in the UK a ringer, which is basically someone who isn't who they say they are. So we also went out to our B2B specialist, and they wouldn't take it on either. So we had to run the recruitment ourselves. And the process we used is the same we use for most of the B2B recruitment if we are going to have to do it ourselves. And our starting point for this is LinkedIn. So what I'm showing here is a screen grab of LinkedIn, and it recreates the search we did for Arrival, which was basically looking for depot managers. And as you can see here, our first sort of search would show there's about 16,000 results. So what that would tell me is we've probably got a chance of recruiting these people, but we then apply as many filters as we can to try and narrow down that sample. What we're going to be doing then is connecting with them and then messaging them. And we can do that manually, particularly if it's a small group and we're going to go through them one at a time. But you can also use things like Octopus CRM, which is an automated outreach program, and it allows you to connect with people on LinkedIn and also then message them. What we have learned is that, what we have learned, excuse me, is that if you're going to do outreach on LinkedIn, it pays to have somebody with a senior title doing it, or changing the person's title in LinkedIn to be more senior. People tend to respond better to that. And we've also found that we're going to need a much bigger incentive to attract attention. Generally, these people have never participated in research before. So, for example, with the depot managers, we had incentives of around 250 to 350 pounds. That's 300 to 400 euros or dollars for them to attend. We also had to allow a lot of time to have calls with them before the research. A lot of them, because they'd never attended research before, had lots of questions about even what to expect in the session, what they were going to have to talk about, what was required of them. And in B2B, that's pretty important, particularly if you're going to ask them about their work, because they might feel they're going to be asked to reveal sensitive information. So in all the research, but absolutely vital in B2B, it's important to be prepared. And so one of the ways we do that is using a framework we developed, and I thought it might be helpful to share that with you. The framework is quite useful even for B2C, actually. So it's a very simple ABC model, and the ABC stands for availability, benefit, and concerns. And really what it's about is researching the individual profile that we're going to be recruiting. So let's take a look at each of those. So firstly, availability. Are they able to attend, or is there something stopping them? So there could be a variety of reasons for this. They may work hours, such as overseas traders. Their occupation may be time sensitive. They might feel they can't take a break for an hour. It may be that they're not in control of their working time. So if we think about people like firemen, or we've just done research with GPs or couriers, all of these people may not have control of their time. They also might not be able to accept an incentive if they work for a regulated company, and that might put them off even talking to us in the first place. Or it might be that they can't attend a session in Zoom or in Teams. Perhaps if they're going to be in their workplace and they've got an internal IT security set up that precludes them accessing it. We've had that come up quite a bit. In terms of benefit, we try and think about, well, what's in it for them? So it could be the research just isn't important for them, and the incentive might not be sufficient to motivate them to come along. But they may consider attending if there's a learning opportunity. So it might not be about incentive. We might have to think about, well, what else is it? It could be perhaps it's a competitor product that they are quite interested in learning about. Or they might attend if they think they're helping someone. Perhaps if the research is for a charity, or it's for a system that might change people's lives. So it could be, that there's an altruistic sort of viewpoint for them, and that could be a benefit that encourages them to come. Or they could benefit perhaps if it's a new version of a system they're actually regularly using. So particularly if they're working in a software system and the research is for that company, then they might feel having an influence on how that product develops is enough benefit for them to attend. Concerns. So are they likely to be worried about anything? So it could be, particularly if the research is in person, but even online, it could be they're worried about their appearance. Could be they're worried about their technical ability, the access arrangements. For example, if they're in a wheelchair and the research is in person, we might have to, make sure that they understand it's an accessible location. They could have privacy concerns and worry about what personal data they'll be sharing. And as I mentioned earlier, if it's about their work, they may be worried that they'll be expected to divulge confidential information, maybe about how their employer works. We had exactly this issue actually working with Facebook when they were launching their workplace platform. And we were talking to people about their use of other similar platforms like Slack and Teams. And they were quite worried about how much they'd have to share about their working practices. So using the ABC framework helps us to consider what we'll need to think about when we recruit B2B participants. And really what it does is make us pause and think about what we're doing rather than sort of rushing straight into the screener, which a lot of these projects are time sensitive and we always have a bit of a tendency to do that. So next and sort of finally, I want to talk about a few of the techniques that you can use, we use to address some of these availability, benefit and concern issues, and also just other techniques we use to help with B2B participant recruitment. Excuse me. So recruiting a proxy. So if you've never done that before, what that means really is recruiting someone who's similar but not the same as the person you want to get. So we've had projects, for example, where our client, maybe they're a bank, wants us to recruit one of their customers, perhaps in a finance function, say a finance manager, to try out a new feature or function of the business banking setup. Now, if they're a small bank, it could be really hard to recruit one of their actual customers, particularly if they're not giving us a customer list and we've got to go out to the market. But as you would imagine, finance managers are very similar in role and responsibility, and their banking needs are therefore very similar. So actually, this is an example where we talk to the customer about letting us recruit a proxy by recruiting a participant who banks with a larger bank, but has the same role and the same needs. And that can be true of a number of different things, across a range of different industries. As long as we're getting someone with very similar needs, a proxy can provide us with the insight we need. This is far more, by the way, for evaluative research than discovery. Building a panel. So if your research needs are ongoing and participants are hard to find, you should consider building a panel. And lots of companies do this. Dropbox, for example, they have their own customer, they call it a customer advisory board. And we've, in previous agencies, I've built panels. For example, we did one for Chartered Institute of Personal Development in the UK. And they're really effective, and they do provide a ready source of participants. It's fair to say they're not necessarily cheaper, because you have to invest quite a lot of time. And although you may not then pay, specifically to recruit an individual, you are paying to manage that panel. And you should keep in mind that panels need to be maintained. If you stop using it, you do risk disenfranchising the members of the panel. And those members, of course, are your customers. So you've got to think about the scale of it, how many people you need in it, and how you're going to manage it on an ongoing basis, and also set expectations. Is this going to be forever, or is it going to be time bound? So one of the other techniques we use is lining people up for future research. So if we do manage to recruit someone who's been very hard to get, we try not to miss the opportunity to ask if they would be prepared to attend a future research session. This obviously keeps the cost of recruitment low, which is nice, and it provides a pipeline of candidates, which is very good. And for B2B, if your research is spaced out, it doesn't always matter if people are coming back and attending, particularly if they're not, professional participants, because they're very authentic and they have genuine needs that you're addressing. If you're having, I mentioned earlier about stakeholders who might be worried about who talks to their customers. And if you get your participants to agree to future research, this is a great way of illustrating to those stakeholders that actually your customers are happy to participate in research, and they're very willing to get involved, and that can reduce the barriers and help you then recruit more people. You should also be asking for referrals when you're recruiting. So we did that in the Arrival project. Actually, once we'd recruited one person, we said, okay, do you know anyone else? Because what you tend to find is a lot of people are members of industry bodies, and so they may well know other depot managers, other finance managers, or they may have worked with them before and they've moved on, but they're still connected. And we've offered them, on top of their incentive, a referral fee for introducing us, should that introduction lead to somebody participating in the research. So again, another technique that's worth considering. So flexibility, I mean, you can look to be flexible in a number of ways, but the schedule is one of those. So what I'm showing here is typical kind of research sort of schedule for 2 days of sort of 60-minute sessions, 10 participants. And often we're trying to organize research like this because the stakeholder wants it neatly organized so they know when they're going to be attending. It's efficient for us, maybe, to keep our utilization high. It's better for the recruiter because they know what slots they've got to fill. But for B2B, we might need to be a lot more flexible. So for a start, you might want to consider shortening the session, particularly with really hard to find people. 15 minutes with the right person is better with 60 minutes with the wrong person. So if that's all they can spare, book them in, do what you can. And, again, your prioritizing in the discussion guide will help you then. Also plan the research over more moderation days with flexibility in the timing of the day. We've just recently done a project, B2B, where it would have been 2 days research, but we planned it over 4. So we could accommodate far more flexibility in the scheduling. Also, for international research, if you're running it cross-border, flexibility actually can be an advantage. So for us, if we're running, for example, research in the UK, and it's a researcher doing it who's based in the US, their day is the UK's evening. So of course, we can offer flexibility in evenings without actually interrupting our working day. Also, keep in mind, for some of these roles, we might have to do weekend slots. So, be prepared to offer those as well, particularly for people on shifts, in those kind of GP, medical, those kind of environments. So location, obviously locations changed a lot post-pandemic, and whereas we used to be in the lab a lot, we're now remote, and remote was always a tactic if people couldn't enter the lab. But actually, if somebody can't even enter the online session for whatever reason, maybe the technical reasons we spoke about earlier, you could have a phone call with them. Discovery research is perfectly valid to have a phone call with someone, an hour's phone call. You don't gain that much value from seeing them. It's nice to, but it's a perfectly valid way of gathering data. So finally, I want to sort of emphasize that I think with B2B, it's important to treat them like VIPs, really. Recognize the opportunity is rare and treat it as such. I've mentioned it already, but think about how you can be flexible in a number of different ways. For example, we've paid incentives to chosen charity on behalf of the participant before because they work for a regulated business and they couldn't accept the incentive due to bribery policies. We also might have to think about changing the method. So if somebody can't attend an hour session for whatever reason, perhaps a diary study would work, or a homework task. They might be able to compile something in their own time that would provide you with an awful lot of the answers you were looking for. So would a different methodology for a particular participant help you, deliver the research? And the final sort of thing to mention is don't waste their time. So we've run multi-market studies in the past where we've been running in sort of UK, US, Germany, Brazil, whatever. And the client didn't translate the research assets. In this case, it was a prototype. So it really was kind of disrespectful to the investment of time with their own customers. And also, of course, invalidated the research, really. Nearly everything was about problems with understanding of the interface rather than what we were actually trying to find out. So don't cut corners. If you're going B2B, these are rare. It takes a lot of effort. Make sure you maximize the time and don't waste theirs or your time. So that's all I've got to say, really. Remember your ABC: availability, benefit, concern, and use this framework to allow yourself time to properly prepare. It'll give you a stronger likelihood of achieving your quota and hopefully talking to the right people. So I'm happy to take any questions now. I'll hand back to Jason in a second. Obviously, feel free to reach out to me directly or on LinkedIn if you want to.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. No, I think that was brilliant. Some really great tips that have been shared, and I know a lot of it's been built over a number of years of experience. and probably a lot of pain in trying to recruit some of these B2B participants. We know firsthand that some of the niche roles and certainly the specialist sectors can be very tricky, and how that directly impacts the quality of the research and insights that's then being delivered. So I'm just having a look at this in the chat. We have some questions, which is always good. The first question is, what level / percentage of over recruit would you recommend for a B2B research study?
That's a really good question. Generally, in my experience, a lot of the decision over recruiting often comes down to budget and time. Actually, I think in an ideal world, you'd look to get 30 to 40% over recruit, in part because depending on the profile, I have to say, but in part because finding really accurate profiles in B2B is actually really quite hard, because job titles actually don't always reveal what the role is, and sometimes even with screening, it can be quite hard because people make assumptions about what they think they know. So I'd go for much more than in B2C, and sort of 30 to 40% if you can. But to be honest, what I generally find is with B2B, we're trying to get to quota. That even getting to quota is the challenge. So that's the bigger thing there as much as anything. But if you can, 30 to 40% over would be a good target.
Sounds good. And Kate asks, what 3 post-screening questions could you ask if you were unsure?
Unsure about what? If
she doesn't actually say, but I imagine what 3 post-screening questions, presumably to ensure
I think
screening them in.
Yeah, I think that probably refers to recruiting your customer's client or your client's customer, which I talked to earlier about post-screening. Again, we would normally build a full screener, actually. Oh, thank you, Kate. Build a full screener on that, and then try and actually re-screen them through that. But top 3, I can't answer that without knowing what we'd be screening on. But we would pick the critical questions if we could only ask 3. But actually, my recommendation would be we would cut out of the screener any of the things that are in, like employment and stuff, which we know are coming through from the client. But we would still try and screen them on everything else. But partly because I've been in too many B2B research sessions where actually the participant isn't right, and they are the client's customer, but they're still slightly the wrong profile.
Superb, thank you. I've got another question here. We're planning to do some continuous research with a group of B2B participants throughout the year. What would be the best way to retain their commitment?
That's a good question. The definition of continuous research is slightly fluid because it's quite new. I think my view would be for B2B, continuous research requires continuous recruitment. So I don't think it's necessarily about engaging, because engaging and retaining. I think what I would do is run a continuous recruitment. In fact, we have run a continuous sort of recruitment program. So we're constantly reaching out on platforms like LinkedIn or to a customer base, looking to see who's available. And as they become available, then slotting them in. And that's the continual program. Because I think if you get a lot up front and then you're trying to slot them in, that really is akin to building a panel.
Superb, thank you. And Erin says, how crucial is it to have the client's help when recruiting B2B?
I think that depends on the profiles, actually. So if your client's customer is in a fairly common role, I mentioned like a finance manager earlier, then no, it isn't critical. But A good example actually is we've done research just recently for a software company that provides a platform for care workers, and the research was with their customers, and the software is very tailored. In that situation, we absolutely needed their help because we really had to have their customers and users of the platform. So I think it really depends on what it is, but yeah, generally it's where that platform is very specific and the user is perhaps using a customized version of it or something like that.
Okay. There's another one here. Adam's asked, going back to trying to recruit via LinkedIn, what are the risks with customer data stroke GDPR when using an open platform?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. But I mean, all of the activity that goes on LinkedIn actually is just exchanging messages, and we're not pulling people into a database from there particularly. Even in the Octopus CRM that I mentioned, it's still a managed environment where people are only sharing the information they want. The minute we get them, you know, if a participant candidate says, I'm interested in potentially participating in this research, we will move them straight into our screening and everything else platform where their GDPR stuff is all managed in there. So we don't capture any data from them there. So we're not even pre-screening. We're using filtering in LinkedIn to narrow down the group, but we will then screen outside of that platform and do it all where we can manage the GDPR implications.
Okay. And we have, there's another question here. This is, bear with me, I'll read this out. This is quite a little long.
I can see them actually, Jason.
Can you, Lulu? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I really like the idea of creating a panel and doing the same thing at work. Find it challenging to maintain the panel, ensure continuous participation. Do you have any suggestions, especially considering the situation where we're providing incentives is not possible, and how to maintain a panel? Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way I've done it in the past is the continuous engagement piece has been done by, frankly, fabricating small surveys and questionnaires, even if we weren't running research. So we had a constant stream of things that were maintaining engagement that probably were things we would like to know, but weren't necessarily, you know, popping out of the research program actually, just to keep them maintained. And in part, that situation is important where the flow of research isn't at a high enough volume to keep them engaged. So we did literally fabricate things. And again, in terms of incentive, we did similar things. So if we couldn't incent, we would, again, use the panel to engage them and make them feel like they were definitely influencing the direction of travel of the product. So we really got them engaged in it, and that worked well. Again, on occasions, we did create sort of engagement tools that weren't necessarily called for out of the research to just get them engaged, and still to do that thing about making them feel like they were really influencing the direction of the product. But yeah, that's how we did it. I think that hopefully that answers the question.
Superb. Well, we're at time. Paul has said no questions, but yeah, thanks a lot, Paul. Great presentation. I think we'd all agree with that. If there are any other questions that come to mind as you leave the webinar, there'll be an email address there for you to please fire them through, and we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you for taking the time for joining us, and we hope to see you on our next webinar next quarter. Let's say thank you very much for joining.